Hey, General, you with me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I want to begin by asking you, I don't know if you saw the State of the Union, but I was certainly impressed by General McGee of the Tuskegee Airmen. We've got a 100-year-old fighter pilot, looked like he could get behind the cockpit, get into the cockpit and fly again.
Yeah, he was and is an extraordinary individual, and it was really heartwarming to see the president recognize such a genuine American hero.
At the same time there's a movie out, General, called Last Full Measure about a fellow by the name of William Pitsenbarger, the only one of three enlisted airmen ever to receive the Medal of Honor for bravery as a parajumper in a 1966 battle in Vietnam. I was wholly unaware of this story, very impressed with the movie, which starred, among others, Samuel L. Jackson, and they had Peter Fonda, and they've got William Hurt in it and Ed Harris. Were you aware of the Pitsenbarger story?
Yes, his story is one that is familiar to those in the Air Force. I have to admit my schedule has prevented me from seeing the movie so far, but it's on the top of my to-do list. So I'm glad to hear that you took away a very positive impression from that whole story.
I did. It's a credit to the Air Force that it got made. You could tell they had some help in getting it made. Now let's get to the story of the morning, which comes from Foreign Policy magazine, and it suggests that the United States Department of Defense is about a policy, a plan to retire hundreds of the Air Force's aging fighter jets and bombing aircrafts over the next 5 years. This comes from Laura Seligman in Foreign Policy magazine. The Pentagon will propose retiring many of its older aircraft as new capabilities come online. What do you think about this, General Deptula? And do we need these older F-15s, F-16s, and 17 of the roughly 60 non-nuclear B-1s, along with 21 of the RQ-4 Global Hawk drones slated for the boneyard?
Well, Hugh, you put your finger on an extraordinarily important issue, and here's the bottom line up front. The bottom line up front is that the United States Air Force and now Space Force, both under the Department of the Air Force, are and have been given way too much more mission than the resources they've been allocated to accomplish it. So the Air Force has been put in this extraordinarily difficult position of, okay, they have to make a choice. We can continue to sustain our geriatric forces. Remember, we've got bombers. The majority of our bomber force, the B-52, the youngest B-52 is 56 years old. We have tankers that are over 50 years old. We have trainers that are over 50 years old. Our fighters are over 30 years old. So the point is, we've got an increasingly aging force that costs a lot of money to maintain as parts age out and the systems simply wear out. That's what's happened with the B-1, Hugh. The reason the Air Force is going to put up and recommend retiring 17 of the 61 B-1s is they're simply worn out and they're becoming dangerous to fly. Now, at the same time, we need to prepare for a future and gain the capabilities necessary to be able to achieve deterrence and deter potential adversaries from winning in the future, and that requires investment. So the Air Force is in this quandary. They don't have enough money to both maintain the current forces and invest in the future. So they're taking some prudent measures in the context of, okay, how do we get rid of or retire some of the most costly aging force to free up funds that we can invest in a necessary future?
Now, this seems to me, to borrow an analogy from history, when the Japanese admirals were trying to change out their force structure in the Battle of Midway, they got caught. They got caught trying to get their fighters up and bring their bombers down, and they got destroyed. You're trying to retire a bunch of things while you bring on the new F-15EX, the Lockheed F-35, and the Northrop Grumman B-21. Is there a plan that you're comfortable with, General Deptula, that will make that switch in time efficiently?
It's going to be a challenge, Hugh. It's going to be an extraordinary challenge. And the fact of the matter is, The United States Air Force needs greater resources to accomplish the missions that it's been given. And the fact of the matter is that we have maintained a relative period of peace, understanding the deployments and the challenges that we've had fighting terrorism, but we have not been in a major regional conflict since Desert Storm in 1991. And until the Congress realizes that the Department of Defense and the Air Force in particular needs greater resources to be able to achieve the kind of deterrent effect that will prevent war in the future, I'm afraid that when we do get into the next big dust-up, it's going to look ugly.
Now, General Deptula, at the risk of getting my friend Secretary Pompeo and Senator Cotton mad at me, Army men true and strong, I know the Navy needs a bigger top line. I've been persuaded and arguing that for a long time. I know these B-21s are absolutely essential to the triad. It does seem to me that big Army is where the belt needs to be tightened because we're just not going to do ground wars for a long time. We're going to do South China Sea great power competition. So if you're recasting that pie, which has traditionally been a third, isn't it about time they got to go to 35, 35, 30, if not more, with the 30 being the Army?
Well, Hugh, those numbers are based on mythology. One of the things I believe I mentioned briefly last time we talked is in the United States Air Force budget is $40 billion of what's called pass-through. That's money to fund space intelligence accounts that the Air Force has no control over. So if you take that $40 billion out, the Air Force isn't getting 1/3, it's getting 1/5 of the current budget. So we need to fix that. But back to your point, look, we need all the services. So we need a strong Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. However, you put your finger on something. You can reconstitute soldiers on the ground relatively quickly. So a large number of the personnel in the United States Army can be put in the Guard and the reserves, which can save an enormous amount of money, which we can then use to recapitalize our geriatric Air Force. So your perspective is an accurate one.
Is anyone doing that work? Is Secretary Esper doing that work? And when you say it's 1/5, not 1/3, where does a civilian like me who would actually like to see the reality of where the top lines are and where they are going and the argument about over where they need to be, where does someone like me go?
Well, you go to the service posture hearings that are going to come up in the posture statements, and you have to read all of them. You're going to get each of the services' flavor, and then the Secretary of Defense's overarching testimony. These issues tend to get very complex real quick. However, the broad brush perspectives are included in those posture statements. And then folks need to be reading the documents and the perspectives that are out there on some of these key issues. I mean, that's a function of what I do in the context of Mitchell Institute and getting some of these issues out into the public. I'm going to have one coming out here pretty shortly that addresses what we need to do to set up the Space Force for success. I mean, the President's created this new Space Force, but it only consists of airmen that are coming out of the Air Force, no additional resources, and no consolidation of the 60 different organizations in the government that have a hand in space. These are things that need to be fixed if, in fact, we're going to succeed in space. So there's another one that we need to pay attention to.
So last question. Does Secretary Esper lay down this budget allocation when all is said and done? Congress makes it, but they have to operate off of someone's recommendation, or is it the OMB?
It's a combination of both. OMB tends to set large macro-scale objectives in terms of a defense obligational authority, and then Secretary Esper comes up with a department-wide plan that each one of the services fights hard to obtain. So it is a difficult process, but here's the bottom line, Hugh. We formed this nation to provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare, not the other way around.
General David Deptula, retired United States Air Force head.